So how many people here are actually using containers? Okay, so maybe that's why we're not talking about containers so much, because it's almost by default now, right? So what I'm going to talk about is using metadata to get your wild container images under control and stop them running amok. I should probably say, my name's Liz. I'm from a startup called Microscaling Systems, and we're building some technology around sort of tooling for containers. And so containers is really what I'm interested in at the moment. But before I start talking about containers, I want to read a poem. Why not? This is by the excellent Brian Bilston, who is just genius. Anyway, just in case you can't read this. Frisbee whizzing through the air, above our heads, over the sand, into the water, onto the waves, out to sea. You cried a lot that day. Frisbee was a lovely dog. And the reason why I wanted to use that poem is not just because it's funny and I love it, but also because it tells us something about the power of naming. Naming things is important. This only works because Frisbee is a dog. We've labelled a dog with the name Frisbee. And Frisbee is obviously a pet, which leads us neatly onto cattle versus pets. I'm going to assume you've all heard this idea of cattle versus pets. Your containers are like cattle. You achieve scale by having multiple instances of the... If I moved these, would that anybody tell me off? They're really distracting. That's fine, because you can still hear me from this, right? Okay, good. You scale your containers by having multiple instances of them. They're a bit like a field of cows. They kind of all look the same from a distance. If you really want to, you can get up close and look at the tags, but basically, you don't really need to know which one's which. And if one of them kind of dies, you'll just get another one and you won't really be very upset. The pets, however, perhaps you should be treating your container images more like pets. You don't really want a sort of inordinately large number of container images running around loose. You want to know who they are. You want to know where they are. You want to give your container images names, perhaps Frisbee, perhaps something a little bit more meaningful. So what is a container image? We often talk about containers as a really nice, convenient way of packaging up your application. So you've got your application code and everything that it depends on, all wrapped up in this image, all the binaries, all the libraries that it depends upon. And just sort of digging into that in a tiny little bit more detail. If we assume that our host operating system is some sort of Linux, and it's got, directories like /bin and /temp in the root directory, somewhere in that file system are your images. They might be in var libdocker, they might be somewhere else, but your container images are just part of the file system. And when you start a container, it gets a copy of this sort of image. And if it's a container that's based on a Linux, it's got its own version of /bin and /proc and what have you, all bundled up nicely inside its own image. So it's a process running in Linux, looking at its own set of directories and thinking it's looking at root, but actually it's looking at its own copy. Okay, so I kind of like to do stuff rather than just talking about it. So let's make a container image. Right, can you see that? Is that big enough? Anybody not see? Good. Right, so, let's start again from scratch. Right, so we're going to start from a version of Linux called Alpine. If you're not familiar with it, it's just a nice small 5 megabyte image that looks like Linux, and you can run a shell in it and things like that. And we're just going to make a very simple container that when we run it, by default, you've always got to start with hello world, right? So let's do that. So I should be able to build this container, and by default it picks up the Docker file in the local directory. So I've built a container with the snappy name of 4043 80db75a. Remember that, it might come in handy. No, we don't need to remember all of that, but we do need to remember enough to run it. We'll call it 4043, that's probably enough. Hello world, that's pretty good, right? We've created a container. Let's override the default command and just have a quick look at what's inside its root directory. So as you can see, you go into that container image and you can see a bin and a temp and a user and what have you, just like any other Linux sitting there inside that container image. So that's kind of what the container image is. Oh, no, let's just, yeah, let's change the code. So, you're not just the world, are you? You are operability. So if I can build this again, and this one's called 1452, whatever. And it says hello operability. So now I have two versions of approximately the same code. Obviously, you might be making more sophisticated code when you're building your own images. Let's look at the images we have. Okay, so we can see at the top, there's a couple of images there, one that I built about a minute ago, one about 24 seconds ago, and those are my two different images. So every time you make a code change and build a new image, they are immutable. You're adding another image to your collection of images. And as you can see, I've got quite a few knocking about locally. So a lot of you are using containers. I'm guessing a lot of you are using microservices. So roughly how many different microservices do you have? Sort of shout out. Anybody running 20 microservices? At least 20. Yeah, a few. Anybody running 100 different microservices? Yeah, a few having 100 different microservices. Okay. And how many of you are building your container images as part of some kind of continuous integration, automated build? Yeah, most people, as far as I can tell, because it's a bit hard. Okay, so every time a developer checks in a piece of code and builds an image, you get more of these images knocking about. And this first sort of struck me as, oh, this is maybe an interesting thing that people don't necessarily think about. When I was talking to, well, we'll call him Stuart, and his company had been using containers for about, I think it was 6 months at the time, and maybe they have 100, maybe 200 engineers, I'm not quite sure. And over the course of the 6 months or what have you, they'd been building their software into images, and they'd been pushing those images onto their own repository. They were storing it in Amazon, I think, running their own private repository. And after a few months, they realized that these little images, because we all think they're really little, right? But they built 186,000 of them. And it was actually turning into a little bit of a kind of cost item that they needed to take account of. And they were like, oh, wait a minute. Pretty sure we don't need all 186,000 of those images, but it's a bit like advertising. You know you need some of it, but you don't necessarily know which ones. And they didn't know which images they needed because they hadn't really made any great efforts to label or identify those different images in any way. They'd just been building them, maybe giving them some tags, which we'll look at, and storing them in the repository. And they breed like rabbits. So tagging is the very obvious thing that you can do to identify your different containers. So if I remember rightly, that one that we did 24 seconds ago was saying hello operability, and 4043 was saying hello world. So we might tag 4043 4043, let's call that OIO. And the other one, 1452, and we'll call that operability, because I think that's the one. Let's check. If we run that one, operability, yeah, that says hello operability. So now if I look at my images, they've got these tags. One's called operability and one is called latest. You might note, latest is not the latest. Latest was built 5 minutes ago and operability was built 4 minutes ago. If I was inventing this, I think I might have thought the word default would be more appropriate than latest. So in your mind, every time you see latest, I want you to mentally translate that into default, because it's just what, if you don't specify a tag, you'll get latest. And as an example of that, this is the Ubuntu repository on Docker Hub. And we can see there is a latest version. It's 16.04, and it was built on the 18th of August. There is a newer version built about a week later, but it's the development version. They're not expecting you to build with that. They're expecting you to build with latest. Latest is the one that they, unless you know better, that's a good version to use. So nothing wrong with using the tag latest, but you do need to be aware that it doesn't necessarily mean whatever I just pushed most recently. Okay. So tags take us so far. There's some things you can do with tags. I don't know if you noticed, I've got a few builds here that have got things like that. 0.9.5-8db, that's like a version number and a git tag. That's kind of handy. You can, overload that tag with some useful and meaningful data. But there's a limit to what you can fit into a tag and how meaningful that can be. But fortunately, we have labels. So you can add labels which are really just key value pairs. So we'll add some labels here. And the event, let's say the event is operability and the venue is the Barbican. Oops. Okay, and build, I'm going to tag this one. Let's call it op. Okay, and if I inspect that one, never mind, F6BA. And you can see there, sort of about a third of the way down the page there, or down the screen, we've got the event, operability, we've got the venue, Barbican. So you could put any values you like, any key value pairs you like, into your container image. And that could be really useful. There are all sorts of really cool things you could do with that. Except these are immutable, right? So what if you want to change that at runtime? What if, like me, on the way here, I built into my sort of brain that the venue was the Barbican, but actually when I got here and went to the Barbican, I discovered that it was not in fact the Barbican, it was Milton Court, is it? So maybe I want to change my tag at runtime, and I might say the venue is Milton Court, and I think I called it op. Okay. I ran that in detached mode, that was the -D, so that I can inspect it. So I'm actually looking at the running instance of the container rather than the container image, and lots of info here, but somewhere we will find, in the middle of the screen there, the event is still operability, but now the venue is Milton Court. So I've been able to override my label at runtime. So perfectly meaningful to have metadata associated with your container image at build time, And some things only make sense at build time, like what git commit was included in that image. And other things that you definitely want to be able to override at runtime, and you can do that. One of the things that, actually let's look at it here. One of the things that we've been working on is a tool called MicroBadger, which lets you inspect all the metadata associated with a container image on Docker Hub. And this is the CentOS base image. And it's got some labels built into it. We can see it's got things like a build date that actually matches the creation date. That appears to be sort of maintained correctly. It tells us who it's by and what the product is, that it is the CentOS base image. And you'll also notice that it has a GPL v2 license. I am not a lawyer. I don't know what it means to say this license is, I've called it GPL. I don't know not me, whoever built this image called it GPL. I don't know what that means in terms of inheritance. But I would lay money that people like this is just a random example of somebody who has almost certainly inherited those labels. So if you know how I did from Alpine, if I'd done from CentOS, unless I override those labels, I'll get the same labels. This could have been done completely deliberately, but this image has inherited GPL as a license. Perhaps intentionally, perhaps not. I suspect not, and the reason why I suspect not is because the build date here is the 31st of March, but this image was actually created on the 15th of June. And that just gives me an inkling that perhaps the person who built this image didn't ever look at the labels. So if you're building on top of public images, you might want to use Docker Inspect or a tool like MicroBadger to have a look at what's inside, because, as I say, it may not matter, but maybe it does matter. Maybe you're building things that you didn't intend to GPL on top of a GPL image, and maybe that has consequences. Okay. So a few examples of the kinds of things you might put in your labels. In Sarah's talk, she showed us quite a lot of documentation around how, there's information that you want when you're running a piece of software in production that you want to be able to lay your hands on at any moment. And one thing you could do is have that associated with the container itself, so that when you look at usage information, or maybe there's a link to some information about how you run or who you contact in the event of some hideous problem. Maybe you want to know who the vendor is. Maybe you're using third-party images. Maybe you are the vendor and you want to be able to, let your customers or your users know who this image comes from. So all sorts of powerful and interesting things that you could put inside an image. Some examples of things you could do with tooling on top of that. For example, you could, maybe you're using some kind of alarm system, a paging system, and your container image plus runtime information could tell you who to contact in the event of, a 24/7 style alert. You could update that, because remember your container images, your containers are cattle. You can shoot them. So if you've got the wrong contact information in the metadata, in the runtime metadata, you can just shoot those containers and start new ones with the correct contact information. Build time information, like exactly which git commit, will really help your team debug problems in the field when they know exactly what code was being run. And it'd be pretty nice if you could find out in your logging system exactly what version you were running. And if your logging system uses the same key to pull out what the version information as your build system uses to put it in, if they're sharing the same understanding of what key says what version is running, then that's pretty cool, because as a consumer, as a user of that container, you only need to have one key, but it can be meaningful to several different tools. Another example of the kind of reason why you might want tooling to understand your labels and you want your containers labeled is things like vendors. Maybe, if you work for a large organization and I don't know, some kind of merger and acquisition happens and it suddenly becomes imperative that you're not using code that's written by a competitor, you might need to know in a hurry where all your code comes from. And knowing things like the vendor that supplied your container images would be a pretty useful thing to know. So these are all really useful and interesting things that can be embedded in the metadata from your containers. And it's even better if different tools have the same common understanding of what those different labels mean. Label schema is an initiative that I've been working on, but with lots of other people from kind of the container community, if you like. I know Gareth from Puppet is here. There's been people from all sorts of interesting companies and organizations who are kind of, as a community, we're trying to say it would be useful to have this common understanding of the key value pairs for labels. We would love input on this, and now is a really good time to get involved because we've got a release candidate for the first version of Label Schema. You can look at it on labelschema.org. There's a mailing list. We're also really keen to find examples of people using metadata in the wild, and how you're finding it useful and how we can sort of use that to encourage more tool vendors to adopt the same schema. So, metadata is really powerful. I very much encourage you to use it, to think about ways that you could automate your processes more thoroughly if you had a better understanding of your container images. You might want to just take a look at the container images you're running that you've got from third parties and just check there aren't any sort of hidden surprises, anything unexpected lurking in that metadata. And definitely we would love more people to get involved in label schema and give us your feedback on that. With that, if you want to know another Brian Bilston poem, you can ask me that afterwards. I think that's it. Any questions? Or you can just break into wild, spontaneous applause. That is also okay.